Chapter 14. The Behemoth. It must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries, who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchant bankers, who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks. This dominance of investment bankers was based on their control over the flows of credit and investment funds in their own countries and throughout the world. They could dominate the financial and industrial systems of their own countries by their influence over the flow of current funds through bank loans, the discount rate, and the rediscounting of commercial debts. They could dominate governments by their control over current government loans and the play of the international exchanges. Almost all of this power was exercised by the personal influence and prestige of men who had demonstrated their ability in the past to bring off successful financial coups, to keep their word, to remain cool in a crisis, and to share their winning opportunities with their associates. In this system, the Rothschilds had been preeminent during much of the 19th century, but at the end of that century, they were being replaced by J.P. Morgan, whose central office was in New York, although it was always operated as if it were in London, where it had indeed originated as George Peabody and Company in 1838. Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. On May 17, 1930, the start of the Great Depression, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, a financial institution, opened its headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. Like the Federal Reserve, it was a private financial institution which operated for the benefit of its shareholders. In 1930, the major shareholders were Europe's leading central banks, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the National Bank of Belgium, Reichsbank, the Bank of Italy, the Bank of the Netherlands, and the Bank of Japan. Taking 14% of the new financial enterprise were three private firms: the First National Bank of New York, J.P. Morgan and Company, and the First National Bank of Chicago. The First National Bank of New York, now known as Citibank, became absorbed into the Rockefeller empire through strategic familial unions. Two sons of William Avery Rockefeller, John D.'s brother and business partner, were married to daughters of James Jewett Stilwell, First National Bank of New York's president and board chairman. J.P. Morgan and Company and the First National Bank of Chicago, the other private owners of the BIS, would merge with Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan to become J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the world's largest financial institutions with over 5,100 branches. To settle this new crisis, the Young Conference, named in honor of Owen Young, its chairman, was held in Paris in 1929. Young was closely tied to the Rockefeller empire and served as the president and chairman of the General Electric Company and RCA, two companies in which the Rockefellers were principal shareholders. A compromise had been reached at the Young Conference. The Germans would pay $500 million a year for the next 36 years to England and France, and $375 million for the next 22 years after that to cover the Allies' debt to the United States. The plan was approved at the First Hague Conference. Control of the German economy was returned to Berlin, and a new bank, the Bank for International Settlements, was established to administer the payments. The BIS would serve to commercialize the payments, that is, to issue bonds against them, and would act as a lender to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, if the German currency weakened and the government found itself unable to make payments. The mother of banks. Along with Owen Young, the founders of BIS were J.P. Jack Morgan, Thomas W. Lamont, Seymour Parker Gilbert, Jackson Reynolds, and Gates W. McGarrah. Lamont, an ambassador to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, aided Rockefeller in the establishment of the Council on Foreign Relations. Gilbert, a partner of J.P. Morgan, had served as the Undersecretary of the Treasury for the Harding administration. Reynolds was a director of the Federal Reserve of New York and a Morgan economic advisor. McGarrah, who became the first president of BIS, was an official at Chase Manhattan, owned by the House of Rockefeller, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Despite the fact that it was established as a result of the Young Conference, the BIS, in its statement of purpose, made no mention of the mandated reparations. It rather maintained that its objective was to promote the cooperation of central banks and to provide additional facilities for international operations, and to act as trustees or agents in regard to international financial settlements entrusted to it under agreements with the parties concerned. Throughout its history, the BIS referred to itself not as an institution of settlements, but rather as the central banker's central bank, a place where bankers could meet in secret, away from the prying eyes of the press and the nagging demands of the politicians. The Constitution of the BIS was written by Sir Walter Layton, editor of The Economist. Layton, in tandem with the Rothschild family, had created a consortium of British businessmen to promote a united Europe. The concept of a central bank had been advanced during the 1920s by British economist John Maynard Keynes, who called for the creation of a supranational bank that would take command of all national economies, set the exchange rate of all currencies, and manage the value of gold according to a standard commodity index. Since the wealth of the world was being confined more and more to a small group of banking families, the formation of a bank to rule all banks appeared to be inevitable. In 1925, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, sent the following note to Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I rather hope that next summer we may be able to inaugurate a private and eclectic central banks club, small at first, large in the future. A fortress impregnable. The headquarters of the BIS was a renovated hotel near the Basel Central Railroad Station, where meetings were held under tight security and complete secrecy. No minutes, agenda, or attendance list was published in any form, and the building became inviolate, meaning that the Swiss authorities possessed no authority over its premises. Correspondence to the bank was received by diplomatic couriers. Such measures were necessary to safeguard the true purpose of the bank, which Carroll Quigley, one of America's leading economists, described as follows. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Gaining gold. As soon as it was established, the BIS abandoned its effort to settle the matter of Germany's delinquent payments for reparations and took up the task of stabilizing the world's economies. To accomplish this task, it was allocated control of the gold reserves that were held by its member banks. Gold now flowed out of Japan, Europe, and the United States into Basel. But the lion's share of precious metal came from China. During the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek, chairman of the nationalist government, was facing war on two fronts, from Mao Zedong's communist insurgency and Imperial Japan. As his government became increasingly unstable, Chiang began to transfer massive amounts of Chinese gold to the BIS and the Federal Reserve. A story concerning the transfer of 203.43 metric tons to Basel and New York was reported by the New York Times on February 19, 1937. In 1938, Chiang transported an additional 125,000 metric tons of gold for safekeeping. Controlling countries. Through the power of this combined wealth, the BIS could save a country from economic disaster, or drive it into a tailspin, and its transnational actions could take place without political or governmental interference. In the first 6 months of 1931, the BIS advanced $10 million to the Bank of Spain to stabilize the peseta, gave a credit of 100 million Austrian shillings to the Bank of Austria when the Credit Anstalt Bank went belly up, and advanced $5 million to the Hungarian National Bank, which was experiencing a revenue shortfall. An anomalous facility. The activities of the BIS superseded all political, moral, and religious ideologies. The sole concern was the control of capital by the flow of money. Capital represented the resources required to produce goods: coal, oil, iron ore, factories, machine tools, trucks, and roads. Money was the means of purchasing capital. By manipulating the money supply and determining the value of all currencies, the directors of the BIS could hold absolute control over state and society. Personal principles were superfluous. Thus it came to pass that a group of international bankers, including members of the Reichsbank, met each month to manage international economies and to plan a one-world order while war raged around them. And no one objected when Paul Heckler, a German deputy manager at the BIS, signed his correspondence, Heil Hitler. Within the walls of the secure fortress in Basel, the American president of the bank transacted daily business through a French general manager, who had a German assistant general manager, while the secretary general was a subject of Italy. These men were in daily contact with one another as the bank continued to operate as the medium through which all central bankers could exchange finances, financial information, and the means of extracting profit from the international bloodbath. Acts of treason. Throughout World War II, Standard Oil provided the Third Reich with 48,000 tons of oil a month and 11,000 tons of tungsten, the metal necessary to make artillery shells and missiles. Without the ongoing flow of these supplies from the United States, Hitler's war machine would have come to a screeching halt. These transactions took place under the cloak of secrecy at the BIS. The records remained concealed from the press and politicians, and the profits from the sale of these strategic supplies remained tax-exempt. Not only did the Rockefellers supply the Third Reich with oil and tungsten, but they also provided the Nazi scientists and engineers at IG Farben, Germany's leading chemical company, with hydrogenation patents and technology. These designs enabled Farben to produce synthetic oil, gasoline, and rubber, butyl, from coal. By 1939, Standard Oil was also producing tetraethyl lead, no-knock aviation gasoline for the Luftwaffe. The financial arrangements for these transactions were conducted at the BIS, where Gates W. Magara, the Rockefeller lackey, remained in charge. The blatant treason of these acts became apparent when the Rockefellers refused to provide similar assistance to the U.S. War Department. In 1944, Standard Oil was indicted by Assistant Attorney General Thurman Arnold for deliberately blocking the production of synthetic rubber. The company pleaded guilty and agreed to release the patents and processes for use by the United States. But the Rockefellers, who maintained ownership of Standard Oil, were never charged with aiding and abetting the enemy. Top secret leaks. The Rockefellers proved to be magnanimous with their fellow members of the cartel at the BIS. Since Nelson remained wired to the Roosevelt administration and the Council on Foreign Relations retained control of the U.S. State Department, news from the Rockefeller empire could be leaked about the projected American invasions of Europe. In the summer of 1942, news of the planned invasion of Algeria was sent to the governor of the French National Bank, who immediately contacted his German colleague in the BIS, SS Gruppenführer Baron Kurt von Schroeder, who represented the Stein Bank of Cologne. The Germans and their French subsidiaries used the information to make a killing of $175 million in a dollar-for-franc exchange scam. The Führer is your friend. The Rockefellers used the Bank for International Settlements not only as a place to shield and store their ill-gotten gains from the Nazis, but also as a facility to finance a public relations campaign for the Third Reich. Walter Teagle, chairman of Standard Oil of New Jersey, dispatched Ivy Lee, the New York publicity man for the Rockefellers, to work with Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Lee's task was to supply the Nazi government with intelligence on the American reaction to such matters as the German armament program, Germany's treatment of Christians, and the organization of the Gestapo. He was also to keep the American public bamboozled by papering over the more evil aspects of Hitler's regime. For his services, Lee was paid first $3,000, then $4,000 annually through the Bank for International Settlements in the name of I.G. Chemi. The contract was, for obvious reasons, kept oral, and the money was transferred in cash. No entries were made in the BIS books of the employing companies or in those of Ivy Lee himself. After a short period of time, Lee's salary was increased to $25,000 per year, and he began circulating inflammatory Nazi propaganda in the United States, including virulent attacks on the Jews and the Versailles Treaty. Few who read Lee's propaganda were aware that the Rockefellers were now in business with the firm that would produce the gas for the death camps.